In the shadow of Jerusalem's crumbling walls, there stood a man who carried visions too terrible for mortal eyes to bear. His name was Jeremiah. But what history never told you, what the scribes buried in silence, what even the faithful have never dared to speak aloud, is the real reason he wept. Picture this: a young prophet, chosen before birth, falling to his knees in the dust, night after night, begging God to take back the visions he had shown him. Not visions of destruction, everyone knows about those, but something else. Something so profound, so earth-shattering, that Jeremiah carried it in agonizing silence until the very last breath of Jerusalem. What did he see that made the weeping prophet weep? You see, while false prophets promised peace and prosperity, while kings ignored every warning, while priests grew fat on empty rituals, Jeremiah alone carried a secret, a divine revelation hidden in the deepest chambers of his broken heart, something that would forever change how God relates to humanity. For 23 years, he proclaimed judgment. For 23 years, they called him mad. But buried beneath every tear, concealed within every prophecy of doom, lay a truth so beautiful, so revolutionary, that it had to be written not in stone but in something far more precious. The Babylonians came exactly as he warned. The temple burned. The people were scattered. But in that moment of absolute devastation, when everything seemed lost forever, the real purpose of Jeremiah's calling was finally revealed. Before we journey together into this hidden truth, I want to thank every single one of you who has supported this message through super thanks. Your generosity means more than you know. You're not just giving. You're helping spread light to others who feel alone in their calling. Whether you support or not, I'm deeply grateful for your presence here, your time, your attention. It all matters. And if this message resonates with your soul, go ahead. But here's what will shake you to your core. What if everything you thought you knew about Jeremiah's tears was wrong? What if his weeping wasn't just about Jerusalem's destruction, but about something infinitely more personal, more eternal, more magnificent than human eyes have ever witnessed? What was the vision that God showed him in those final moments, the secret he carried through persecution, imprisonment, and the flames of judgment? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will forever change how you understand God's heart for you. The mystery begins now. The ruins tell their story in silence. Picture this: an elderly figure sits alone among the charred stones of what was once the most magnificent city on earth, Jerusalem, the city of God, now reduced to ash and rubble. But this man, this broken prophet, had been weeping long before the first flame ever touched these sacred walls. His name was Jeremiah, and here's what will shake you to your core. His tears didn't begin when Babylon struck. They began decades earlier, when he was just a young man walking through these same streets. When the markets bustled with life, when children played in the squares, when the temple still gleamed with gold, and the priests still offered sacrifices morning and evening. Why was he crying when everyone else was celebrating? What did he see that no one else could see? In a world obsessed with prosperity theology and smooth prophecies, we've forgotten something crucial about the nature of divine revelation. We've sanitized the prophetic calling. We've turned prophets into motivational speakers. But Jeremiah was something else entirely. He was a man chosen by God to carry visions so devastating, so heart-wrenching, that they literally broke him from the inside out. The Hebrew word for Jeremiah's condition isn't just sadness. It's Yerumiyahu, name, that means God will lift up or God will exalt. But the irony cuts deep. Here was a man whose name spoke of elevation, yet his entire ministry was marked by descent into the deepest valleys of human sorrow. Listen to this. Before Jeremiah ever spoke a single prophecy of judgment, before he ever mentioned Babylon, before he ever warned of siege and exile, he was already known throughout Jerusalem as the man who wept. Neighbors would see him walking through the streets with tears streaming down his face, and they would whisper among themselves, "There goes Jeremiah again. What's wrong with him now?" But here's the mystery that has haunted biblical scholars for centuries. What exactly was he seeing that made him cry before the disaster ever came? The answer lies buried in the original Hebrew text, in the spaces between the words, in what the scripture doesn't explicitly say but powerfully implies. You see, when God called Jeremiah, the Almighty reached down and touched the lips of this young man from the small town of Anathoth. He didn't just give him words to speak, he gave him eyes to see. Divine sight, prophetic vision, the terrible gift of seeing not just what is, but what must come to pass. Imagine for a moment what that would feel like. You're walking through your beloved city, watching children laugh and play, seeing merchants hawk their wares, observing priests perform their sacred duties. But superimposed over all of it, like a ghostly double exposure, you see the future. You see those same children starving. You see those merchants' shops in flames. You see those priests fleeing for their lives. You see your mother, your father, your siblings, your friends, all of them walking unknowingly toward the edge of a spiritual cliff. This is why Jeremiah wept, not from weakness, but from a broken heart that could see both present joy and future sorrow existing in the same terrible moment. The ancient rabbis understood something we've largely forgotten in our modern interpretation of prophecy. They taught that true prophets don't just announce God's will, they feel it. They don't just speak God's words, they carry God's emotions. When God grieves, the prophet grieves. When God's heart breaks over the rebellion of his people, the prophet's heart breaks too. Jeremiah wasn't crying because he was depressed. He was crying because he had been given access to the emotional state of the Almighty himself. He was feeling what God felt. As he watched his chosen people drift further and further away from the covenant, deeper and deeper into spiritual adultery, closer and closer to the point of no return. Think about it. What would it feel like to love someone desperately, to have given them everything, to have rescued them, protected them, provided for them, only to watch them turn their back on you day after day? What would it feel like to see them heading straight toward destruction, calling out warning after warning, knowing that they won't listen until it's too late? That's the heart of God, and that's what Jeremiah was carrying. But here's where the story becomes even more haunting, even more profound. The people of Jerusalem didn't just ignore Jeremiah's tears, they mocked them. They laughed at him. They called him the weeping prophet, as a term of derision. They saw his emotional transparency as weakness, his warnings as negativity, his tears as the ravings of a madman. Sound familiar? How often do we, even today, prefer the smooth voices that tell us what we want to hear over the broken voices that tell us what we need to hear? How often do we choose the prophets of prosperity over the prophets of truth? How often do we mistake God's warning trumpets for unnecessary noise? Jeremiah was a trumpet of warning in a generation that preferred lullabies. He was a voice of reality in a culture that had fallen in love with illusion. He was a man carrying divine tears in a society that had forgotten how to weep over their own spiritual condition. And the most tragic part? The tears weren't primarily for the destruction that was coming. The tears were for the blindness of a nation that thought it was safe when it was actually standing on the precipice of spiritual disaster. Comment below if you've ever felt like your tears came before the disaster, if you've ever sensed something others couldn't see, felt burden others couldn't understand. Because what we're about to discover next will reveal the secret that Jeremiah carried for decades in silence. The vision that made him beg God to choose someone else. The revelation that would change everything we think we know about God's heart, his plans, and his unbreakable love for a people who seem determined to break themselves. The weeping was just the beginning. The real mystery lies in what God showed him that made those tears fall in the first place. Before the first star breathed light into darkness, before the foundations of the earth were laid, before time itself drew its first breath. There was a conversation about a boy named Jeremiah, not in the councils of men, not in the chambers of kings, but in the eternal halls of heaven, where God's voice echoes through eternity, declaring destinies before bodies are formed and souls before they draw breath. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. These words would shatter a young man's world, but they reveal something far more profound about the nature of divine calling itself. You see, Jeremiah wasn't chosen because he was qualified. He wasn't selected because he was brave, eloquent, or spiritually mature. He was chosen before any of those things existed, before his mother felt the first flutter of life within her, before his father dreamed of having a son, before Jeremiah himself existed in any form that human eyes could see. God knew him. Not just knew about him, knew him. Intimately, personally, completely. Picture this sacred moment. A young man, perhaps barely 20, walking through the fields of Anathoth, the sun warm on his shoulders, the simple rhythm of ordinary life, and then the silence shatters. Before you were born, I set you apart. The water bucket crashes to the ground. His knees buckle. The world tilts on its axis. Because suddenly, this ordinary boy from an ordinary priestly family discovers that his entire existence has been wrapped around a divine purpose he never chose, never asked for, never imagined. But here's what pierces the heart, his response. "Ah, sovereign Lord, I do not know how to speak. I am too young." Do you hear it? The terror beneath those words? This isn't humble deflection. This is the cry of a soul recognizing that it's about to be consumed by something infinitely larger than itself, like a candle realizing it's been chosen to ignite a forest fire. And then comes the moment that changes everything. God reaches out not metaphorically, but with divine reality that Jeremiah feels as surely as flesh touching flesh and touches his mouth. "I have put my words in your mouth." Picture it. The creator of the universe, whose voice commands galaxies and whose whisper births stars, placing his very words into the mouth of a trembling boy. Not beautiful words, not comfortable words. Words that would tear nations apart and rebuild them. Words that would cost him everything. "Today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant." In that instant, Jeremiah understood something that would torment him for the rest of his life. He hadn't been born to be famous. He hadn't been born to be loved. He hadn't been born to be comfortable or safe or understood. He had been born to carry fire into a field of straw. And somewhere deep in his spirit, like a scroll sealed with divine wax, lay prophecies so devastating, so earth-shaking, that even decades later, even after years of preparation, he would fall to his knees, begging God not to make him speak them. What kind of words burned so deeply in a prophet's heart that he would rather die than voice them? What revelation was so terrible that it would make the weeping prophet weep before he even fully understood what he carried? As young Jeremiah walked home that day, his lips still burning from the divine touch, he had no idea that the words now sealed within him would not only predict the fall of Jerusalem, but would reveal the most beautiful secret in the heart of Goda. Secret so magnificent that it required the complete destruction of everything familiar to make room for something eternally new. The boy who had been touched by heaven was about to discover that some truths are too holy for comfortable delivery. But there, in that sacred silence between calling and catastrophe, something began to stir in the heavens above young Jeremiah, something that would shatter his world forever. The morning mist still clung to the fields of Anathoth when it happened. Jeremiah was walking the familiar path to the well, his mind still reeling from God's impossible call, when suddenly, the ordinary became extraordinary. His eyes fell upon something so simple, so commonplace, that anyone else would have passed it by without a second glance. An almond branch. But this was no ordinary branch. In Hebrew, the word for almond is shatter, meaning the watcher, the wakeful one. The almond tree was always the first to bloom, the first to wake from winter's death. And as Jeremiah stared, transfixed, the voice of the Almighty thundered through his soul. "You have seen well, for I am watching over my word to perform it." Watching, wakeful, ready. God was not sleeping. He was not distant. He was poised like a sentinel over his promises, ready to bring them to pass with the swiftness of spring's first bloom. Every prophecy, every warning, every word of judgment, God would fulfill them all, and quickly. But then came the second vision. The sky seemed to darken, though the sun still shone. Jeremiah's breath caught in his throat as his eyes were drawn upward, and there, hovering in the supernatural realm between earth and heaven, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A massive cauldron, a boiling pot, seething with scalding fury, tilted precariously toward the south. Steam rose from its bubbling contents like the breath of judgment itself, and Jeremiah could feel the heat of it burning against his face, though he stood miles away from any earthly fire. "What do you see?" came the voice again, more urgent now, more terrible. "I see a boiling pot," Jeremiah whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his pounding heart. "And it is tilted away from the north." The answer came like thunder splitting the sky. "From the north disaster will be poured out on all who live in the land. I am about to summon all the peoples of the northern kingdoms. They will come and set up their thrones in the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem, Babylon." Though the name was not yet spoken, Jeremiah knew. The empire of the north, with its iron chariots and bronze weapons, its siege engines and battering rams, they were coming. Not someday, not perhaps, but soon. As swift as the almonds bloom. And in that moment, standing alone in the field with visions of fire dancing before his eyes, Jeremiah understood the terrible weight of his calling. He was not just a prophet of words. He was a watchman on the wall, seeing the torches of the enemy while the city still slept in peaceful ignorance. When he tried to warn Themo, how he tried. He ran to the gates of Jerusalem, his voice cracking with urgency, his hands trembling with the weight of divine revelation. But they laughed. The merchants continued counting their coins. The priests went on with their rituals. The false prophets preached their messages of peace and prosperity. "Where is this disaster you speak of?" they mocked. "Where is your boiling pot? All we see is peace." And so began the loneliest journey in all of Scripture. The agony of knowing what no one else could see. The burden of carrying tomorrow's tragedy in today's heart. Like a man watching a house about to catch fire, screaming warnings to those inside who cannot smell the smoke. He saw the flames while they were still drinking wine at the altar. He felt the heat of judgment while they basked in the false warmth of their prosperity. And with every day that passed, the pot grew hotter, the tilt more severe, the moment of pouring closer at hand. Have you ever seen danger coming, but no one believed you? Have you ever carried a truth so heavy that it bent your shoulders and broke your heart? Then, you know something of what Jeremiah felt in those early days of his calling. But this was only the beginning. For what God was about to show him next would make these first visions seem like gentle whispers compared to the roar of the storm that was coming. The morning mist clung to the stone houses of Anathoth like a shroud. This was home. These narrow streets had witnessed Jeremiah's first steps, his childhood laughter, his father's priestly blessings. But now those same streets whispered of murder. Picture the agony, to be chosen by the Almighty, only to be rejected by your own blood, to carry heaven's fire, only to watch your own village try to snuff it out. It began in Jerusalem's public square. The prophet stood before the crowd, his voice cracking with divine urgency. "Turn back," he pleaded, "before the storm breaks, before the fire falls." But instead of trembling hearts, came the laughter. Prophet of doom, they mocked, their voices echoing off the temple walls. Here comes the son of sorrow. Children threw stones. Merchants turned their backs. Even the priests, those who should have recognized the voice of God, rolled their eyes in disgust. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. When Jeremiah returned to Anathoth, seeking refuge in familiar arms, he discovered a truth that would shatter him more than any Babylonian sword: his own family, his own neighbors. The people who had once bounced him on their knees were now plotting his assassination. The conspiracy was whispered in corners. "Do not prophesy in the name of the Lord," they warned, "or you will die by our hands." Can you imagine? The very lips that had once sung him lullabies now spoke of silencing him forever. Here was a flame of truth, burning bright and true, but surrounded by a village of candles afraid of heat. They preferred their dim, comfortable flicker to the blazing light that exposed their shadows. And so Jeremiah fell. Not from a sword, not from disease, but from something far more devastating: the weight of absolute isolation. There, in the dust of his hometown, he cried out words that pierced through millennia. "Cursed be the day I was born! Why did I come forth from the womb to see trouble and sorrow?" This wasn't rebellion. This was the raw, bleeding heart of a man who had given everything and received nothing but hatred in return. But here's what the mockers never understood. Here's what his assassins couldn't see. Jeremiah's tears weren't just from pain, they were from love. He wept because he saw what was coming. He wept because he cared more about their souls than his own safety. He wept because sometimes love looks like madness to those who refuse to see. The priesthood denounced him. The politicians ignored him. His family betrayed him. His neighbors wanted him dead. Yet still he spoke. Still he warned. Still, he loved them enough to risk everything. What do you do when God sends you to warn those who want you buried for caring? What do you do when the very people you're trying to save are sharpening the knives? You discover something profound about the heart of God. You learn that divine love doesn't stop when human love fails. You understand that sometimes the greatest act of faithfulness is to keep speaking truth to those who would rather silence you than face what's coming. But Jeremiah's story of rejection was about to take an even darker turn, because when words fail to silence a prophet, when mockery can't break his spirit, when even family betrayal can't stop his mission, then comes the iron fist of religious authority. And that would test the very limits of human endurance. The sound of breaking clay, it echoes through eternity. Picture this moment. Jeremiah, the man who had been mocked as a madman, who had been beaten in the stocks, who carried 23 years of divine burden on his shoulders, now stands at the edge of the valley of Hinnom. His hands tremble as they grip a simple potter's jar, the most ordinary object that would become the vessel of the most extraordinary prophecy. But this wasn't just any valley. This was Tophet, the place where children had been sacrificed to Molech, where innocent blood had stained the earth, where the very ground cried out from centuries of unspeakable horror. And God chose this place for his most devastating visual sermon. The religious leaders had followed him curious, suspicious, perhaps sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. These were the men who had dismissed every warning, who had called his prophecies the ravings of a broken mind. But today they would witness something that would haunt their dreams forever. Jeremiah lifted the jar above his head. The sunlight caught the clay, making it gleam like burnished gold. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The wind held its breath. Even the birds fell silent. "Thus says the Lord of hosts." His voice rang out across the valley like thunder breaking over still waters. "So will I break this people and this city, as one breaks a potter's vessel, so that it cannot be made whole again." And then, the sound that would echo through history. Crash. The jar exploded against the rocks. Shards scattered like broken dreams across the blood-soaked earth. The leaders jumped back, their faces pale with shock. Some covered their ears as if the sound had physically wounded them. Others stared at the fragments in horrified fascination. But in that that earth-shaking, covenant-shattering moment, something far deeper was being revealed. This wasn't just about a clay pot. This was about the breaking of something sacred, something that had been carefully formed by divine hands over centuries of patient love. Every piece of that shattered jar represented a broken promise. Every fragment reflected a covenant trampled underfoot. Every shard whispered the name of a people who had chosen idols over their Creator, who had sacrificed their children while claiming to worship the God of life. The priests whispered among themselves, their voices sharp with fear and fury. He must be stopped. This madness cannot continue. If this message is stirring something in your spirit, comment below and share it with someone asleep in a burning world. But here's what they didn't understand, what they couldn't see through their religious blindness. When God breaks something, it's not cruelty, it's preparation. When truth shatters our illusions, it's mercy disguised as judgment. Jeremiah knelt among the broken pieces, tears mixing with the dust of the valley. He gathered some of the fragments in his hands, feeling their sharp edges cut into his palms. His blood, the blood of the prophet, who had been faithful unto death, mingled with the clay that would never be whole again. Yet even as he wept over the shattered vessel, even as the reality of coming destruction pressed upon his heart like a stone, Jeremiah carried within him the secret that would transform everything. The same God who was about to break the old covenant was preparing to write a new one, not on tablets of stone that could be broken, not in vessels of clay that could be shattered, but on something far more precious, far more eternal, on the human heart itself. The temple courtyard buzzed with excitement that morning. Word had spread like wildfire through Jerusalem's narrow streets. Hananiah, son of Azur, the prophet everyone loved to hear, would speak again. Unlike Jeremiah's crushing words of doom, Hananiah brought hope. He brought the messages people's hearts craved to hear. But what unfolded next would reveal something terrifying about the nature of prophecy itself. Picture the scene. Jeremiah stood among the crowd, the heavy wooden yoke still strapped across his shoulders, God's living symbol of Babylon's coming dominion. For months, he had carried this burden through Jerusalem's streets, a walking prophecy that made every merchant, every mother, every priest uncomfortable. The yoke was more than wood. It was truth made tangible. Then Hananiah stepped forward, his voice ringing with confidence that electrified the crowd. "This is what the Lord Almighty says," he declared, his arms raised toward heaven. "Within 2 years I will break the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, from the neck of all the nations." The people erupted. Finally, someone speaking God's language of blessing instead of Jeremiah's endless litany of judgment. Children laughed. Women clapped. Even the priests nodded approvingly. But then something shocking happened. With deliberate, theatrical force, Hananiah strode directly to Jeremiah. In front of the entire assembly, he seized the wooden yoke from the weeping prophet's shoulders and snapped it in half. The crack of splintering wood echoed like thunder through the courtyard. "This is how the Lord will break the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar," Hananiah shouted, holding the broken pieces high like trophies of victory. Jeremiah stood there, humiliated, defenseless. The crowd cheered as if Jerusalem itself had been liberated. The popular prophet had just publicly demolished the unpopular prophet's message. Faith had triumphed over fear. Hope had conquered doom. Or had it? Jeremiah, his face flushed with shame, said nothing. He simply walked away. Through the cheering crowd, past the mocking faces, into the silence of his solitude. But in that silence, heaven was about to speak. "Go and tell Hananiah," came the voice of the Almighty, cutting through Jeremiah's humiliation like a sword. "You have broken a yoke of wood, but in its place I will put a yoke of iron." Iron, Not wood that could be snapped by human hands, but iron that would grind nations into powder. When Jeremiah returned to face Hananiah, his voice carried an authority that made the air itself seem to tremble. "Listen, Hananiah, the Lord has not sent you, yet you have persuaded this nation to trust in lies. Therefore, this is what the Lord says: I am about to remove you from the face of the earth. This very year you are going to die, because you have preached rebellion against the Lord." The crowd fell silent. You could hear sandals shifting nervously on stone. Hananiah tried to maintain his composure, but something had changed in the atmosphere. The confident smile faltered. The color drained from his face. That year, exactly as Jeremiah had prophesied, Hananiah died. The wooden yoke had been broken by human hands, but the iron yoke that replaced it would crush everything in its path. When men attempt to break God's word to please the people, heaven breaks them to restore the truth. Here lies one of Scripture's most chilling revelations. False prophecy isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. It doesn't just mislead, it destroys. When religious leaders tell people what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear, they don't just fail their calling. They become agents of the very judgment they claim to prevent. Jeremiah learned something that night that would mark the rest of his ministry. Truth doesn't always win in the moment. Sometimes it walks away in silence, carrying wounds that only heaven sees. But truth has something false. Prophecy will never possess the power of the eternal breaking into time itself. The iron yoke was coming, and nothing, no false prophet, no popular message, no crowd's approval could stop it. But hidden within this terrifying judgment lay a secret Jeremiah was only beginning to understand. The dawn broke blood red over Jerusalem on that final morning. In the distance, the war drums of Babylon thundered like the heartbeat of judgment itself. And in a prison cell, carved from cold stone beneath the royal palace, sat the man who had seen it all before it happened. Jeremiah pressed his face against the iron bars, his weathered hands gripping the metal until his knuckles turned white. For 23 years, he had proclaimed this day. For 23 years, they had called him mad. Now, as the earth trembled beneath 10,000 Babylonian boots, his prophecies were about to be written in fire and blood. The first scream pierced the morning air, then another, then a sound that would haunt the memory of every survivor, the terrible symphony of a city dying. From his cell window, Jeremiah watched King Nebuchadnezzar's siege engines roll toward the walls, like iron beasts hungry for stone. The same walls where children had played, the same gates where merchants had laughed, the same streets where people had mocked the weeping prophet and his warnings of doom. "I told them," Jeremiah whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Sweet God in heaven," I told them. The temple, Solomon's magnificent temple, the crown jewel of Jerusalem, the dwelling place of the Most High, stood gleaming in the distance, golden and proud and utterly doomed. In hours, it would be nothing but ash and memory. But this was not Jeremiah's first vision of this moment. 23 years earlier, God had shown him this exact scene, not as a possibility, as a certainty. The prophet had seen the flames before the first stone was cast. He had felt the heat of destruction before the first sword was drawn. His tears had begun falling decades before the first drop of blood was shed. The iron gates of Jerusalem cracked like thunder. Babylonian soldiers poured through the breach like a river of bronze and steel, their war cries echoing off the ancient stones. King Zedekiah, the same king who had promised to heed God's warnings, the same king who had begged Jeremiah for a word of hope, fled through his secret garden tunnel like a thief in the night. They caught him near Jericho. What happened next would echo through the corridors of history as one of the most brutal acts of ancient warfare. Nebuchadnezzar forced Zedekiah to watch as his sons were executed before his eyes. The last thing the king of Judah would ever see was the death of his children. Then they put out his eyes with hot bronze, ensuring that this final horror would burn behind his eyelids for the rest of his life. In the streets of Jerusalem, Mothers clutched their babies to their chests as Babylonian soldiers kicked down doors. The elderly fell to their knees in prayer, only to be cut down where they knelt. The young and strong were chained together for the long march to exile. The weak were left to die among the ruins. And through it all, smoke began to rise from the temple. And so the scroll closes, but not on the story, only on that chapter. For 23 years, Jeremiah wept. Not because he was weak, not because he couldn't handle the calling. He wept because he carried tomorrow's headlines in yesterday's heart. He saw the fire before the match was struck. He felt the exile before the chains were forged. He mourned the destruction before the first stone fell. But here's what will shake you to your very core. Jeremiah's tears were never just about Babylon. They were never just about Jerusalem. They were about every generation that would choose rebellion over relationship, every nation that would mock the voice of mercy, every heart that would grow cold to the whisper of warning. His tears were about us. Look around you today. Look at the headlines. Look at the moral landscape of our world. Do you see the patterns? Do you feel the trembling in the spiritual atmosphere? The same pride that filled Jerusalem's streets now fills our cities. The same deaf ears that ignored Jeremiah's warnings now turn away from truth. The same false prophets who promised peace while judgment approached now flood our airwaves with empty hope and shallow promises. We are not just reading about ancient history. We are living in the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. But here's the mystery that Jeremiah carried in his broken heart, the secret that made his tears both bitter and beautiful. God's judgment is never his final word. Even when the temple burned, even when the people were scattered, even when everything seemed lost forever, the new covenant was already being written, not on tablets of stone that could be shattered, but on tablets of flesh that could be transformed. Every tear Jeremiah shed was watering the ground for something unprecedented in human history, a covenant written not in law, but in love, not in commands from heaven, but in the very heart of humanity itself. Think about this. What if the weeping prophet wasn't just mourning what was ending? What if he was also grieving for what was beginning? What if his tears were the birth pangs of a new kind of relationship between God and mankind? Centuries have folded like pages since Jeremiah walked through the ashes of Jerusalem. Empires have risen and fallen. Kingdoms have crumbled to dust. But the echo of his weeping still reverberates through time, still speaks to every generation that finds itself standing at the crossroads between judgment and mercy. Today, you stand at that same crossroads. The question that haunted ancient Judah haunts us still. Will we listen to the voice of warning while there's still time? Will we humble ourselves before the storm arrives? Or will we, like so many before us, mistake God's patience for his approval and his silence for his absence? Jeremiah's story is not just history, it's prophecy. It's a mirror reflecting our own spiritual condition. It's a warning wrapped in love, delivered by a man who would rather weep than watch us fall. In these last days, and make no mistake, we are living in the last days. God is still raising up voices like Jeremiah's, still sending warnings wrapped in mercy, still calling hearts to repentance before the final fire falls. The question is, are we listening? Or are we too busy, too proud, too comfortable to hear the weeping prophet's echo in our own time? For in the hands of God, even ashes can become an altar. Even ruins can become the foundation for something greater. Even the darkest judgment can give birth to the brightest hope. Jeremiah's tears have dried, but his message lives on, written not just in ancient scrolls, but in the very fabric of time itself. A reminder that God's heart breaks long before his hand moves in judgment. A testament that mercy pleads, even when justice demands. And somewhere in the heavenly realm, the weeping prophet waits, watching to see if this generation will heed the warnings his tears have been whispering across the centuries. The scroll may be closed, but the story The story is still being written, and we are holding the pen,